I feel so lucky to be here because there are 4 people here who have really shifted my thinking because of things that they've written. Richard Dawkins from Unweaving the Rainbow was a very profound and important book for me. Darwin's A Dangerous Idea by Daniel Dennett. That was the book that made me stop and say, I'm an atheist. That was the book. And Christopher Hitchens' Missionary Position. Made me look at my choice differently. You know, like, these people are coming at me from such different angles. I was always suspicious about her, but then I knew. But Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, really, you know, and when I read that book, I thought I was done with my shifts. I thought I had had all of the shifts I was going to have. And when I read The End of Faith, I realized that myself, thinking of myself as a liberal, modern, moderate person, even though I might have suspicions about whether there was a God or not, was a completely untenable position to have, and that not only that, I and people like me were partly responsible for what was happening in the world. And in many ways, reading The End of Faith made me feel like I had to be an activist rather than keeping my opinions to myself. And I think of that book so often, and I've given it out to so many people, including my mother, who said, what is the one book that would help me understand what you're going through? Okay, The End of Faith, and I gave her The End of Faith, and then I saw it still on the bookshelf last time I was there this summer, and I thought she's never going to read that book. But for me, it really made a huge shift in the way I looked, because, you know, my world, I don't really run into fundamentalists. That's not part of my world. I live in Los Angeles. I cohort amongst what I consider to be relatively educated people. It's easy to hate the fundamentalists, but Sam, I feel, was the one who really enlightened a lot of people that they couldn't be educated people and not take a stand against religion as a whole. Like, it just wasn't okay anymore to approve of the idea of faith being a positive quality. I was thinking of it in 2 instances in the last 2 weeks. One is a good friend of mine who's also a mother of a child at the school that my daughter goes to, an educated person whose mother is a doctor, who was a doctor in World War II, but is a Methodist, and their family goes to a church for Sunday school. She said to me just this week on the playground, I found out that my mother doesn't believe in evolution. And of course I reject the idea of belief in evolution. I was thinking, it's accept the theory of evolution, but anyway. And I thought, well, that doesn't surprise me in the least. She's a Methodist, and you know, there's some cognitive dissonance in her mind that forces her not to be able to accept the theory of evolution. That doesn't surprise me. But my friend said, who I love very much, but she said, but that's such an uneducated position. That's so embarrassing to me. Lots of really smart people believe in God and evolution. Why can't she just believe in both of them? And I was standing on the playground thinking of Sam Harris. I wanted to hand her The End of Faith right there and say, I used to believe that too. And it was Sam Harris that made me realize that that was wrong. And that really, it's her position that's that's the hardest for me to understand. And I thank Sam so much for that book. And then, of course, as you know, he wrote Letter to a Christian Nation, which is fantastic. That's another little quick book that rightly gets to the heart of things, and was a bestseller as well. And I couldn't be prouder to say that he's now a friend of mine. So, Sam Harris.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank Margaret, first of all, for organizing us and getting us here together. It's taken a tremendous amount of work on her part. I would also like to take a moment to just reflect on how strange it is that a meeting like this is even necessary. And the year is 2007, and we have all taken time out of our busy lives, and some of us have traveled considerable distance, to meet so that we can strategize about how best to live in a world where most people believe in an imaginary God. It seems astonishing that this is even necessary. America is now a nation of 300 million souls, wielding more influence than any people in human history, and yet this influence is being steadily corrupted and is surely waning because something like 240 million of these souls believe that Jesus is going to return and orchestrate the end of human history with his magic powers. Now, I think we may well wonder whether as many people believe these things as say they do. I know that Richard and certainly Christopher are quite more sanguine than I am about our opinion polls being out of register with what people believe in the privacy of their own minds. But it seems to me that our neighbors reliably profess these beliefs, and these professions have themselves done immense harm to our political discourse and to our public policy and to the teaching of science and to our stature in the world. And if even only a third or a quarter believe what most profess, I think it's a problem really worth worrying about. Now, in thinking what I could say to all of you tonight, it's not often that I'm in a room filled with people who are more or less guaranteed to agree with me on the subject of religion. And it seemed to me that in thinking what I have to say to you, I have a choice between throwing red meat to the lions of atheism or in moving the conversation into areas where we might not agree. So at some risk to your mood, I've decided to take the second path. And I think I might say some things that are controversial in this context. Now, given the absence of evidence for God, and given the stupidity and suffering that still thrives under the aegis of religion, atheism would seem to be the only sensible position to stake out. And it's a position that many of us have proudly and publicly adopted, perhaps all of us. I'd like to argue to you tonight that our use of this term atheism is a mistake. And it's a mistake of some consequence. My concerns over the use of the term atheism are both philosophical and strategic. I'm speaking, you should know, from a somewhat unusual position because I never thought of myself as an atheist before being inducted to speak as one. I never used the word in the End of Faith, which remains my most substantial criticism of religion. And as I argued in Letter to a Christian Nation, I think it is a word we fundamentally do not need, in the same way that we don't need a word for someone who rejects astrology. We simply are not tempted to call people non-astrologers. And if the comparison with astrology seems too facile to you, consider racism. Racism was about as intractable a social problem as we have ever had in this country. I'm talking about deeply held convictions. I'm sure many of you, or probably all of you, have seen the photos of lynchings in the first half of the 20th century, where seemingly a whole town in the South, thousands of men, women, and children, lawyers, doctors, newspaper editors, church elders, even the occasional congressman and senator, would turn out as though for a carnival, simply to watch some young man or woman be tortured to death and then strung up on a tree or lamppost for all to see. And even if you've seen these pictures, realize that the pictures themselves are a poor indication of the horror of these episodes. Realize that these genteel people, who were otherwise quite normal, we must presume, though unfailingly religious, often took souvenirs of the body home to show their friends and family, teeth, ears, fingers, toes, and often displayed them in their places of business. Now, of course, I'm not saying racism is no longer a problem in this country, but anyone who thinks that the problem is undiminished has forgotten or has never learned how bad a problem it was. Now, my question to you is, so we've done something to racism. I mean, the KKK was battered to the fringes of society. We had a civil rights movement. We changed our discourse about race. Our major newspapers no longer write flagrantly racist editorials and articles as they did less than a century ago. But how many people have had to identify themselves as non-racists to participate in this process? Is there a non-racist alliance somewhere for me to join? It seems to me that attaching a label to something carries real liabilities especially when the thing you are naming isn't a thing at all. And I would argue to you that atheism is not a thing. It is not a philosophy, just as non-racism is not one. It is not a worldview, and yet it is regularly construed as one and attacked as such. And we who do not believe in God are collaborating in this misunderstanding by consenting to be named and by naming ourselves. Another problem with accepting a label is that we are consenting to be thought of as a marginal interest group. We're consenting to be thought of as a cranky subculture that meets in hotel ballrooms. Now, I'm not saying that meetings like this aren't important. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it was important. But I am saying as a matter of philosophy, we are guilty of a confusion. And as a matter of strategy, I think we've walked into a trap. And it is a trap that, in many cases, I'm convinced, has been deliberately set for us. And we have jumped into it with both feet. Now, while it is an honor for me to find myself continually assailed, along with Dan and Richard and Christopher, as though we were a single person with 4 heads, I think this whole conversation about the new atheists and militant atheism has been used to keep our criticism of religion at arm's length, and has allowed people to reject our arguments without meeting the burden of actually answering them. And I think this whole discourse around the conflict between faith and reason and religion and science has been and will continue to be successfully marginalized under the banner of atheism. So let me make my somewhat seditious proposal explicit. We should not call ourselves atheists. We should not call ourselves secularists. We should not call ourselves secular humanists or freethinkers or rationalists or anti-theists or brights. We should not call ourselves anything. We should go under the radar for the rest of our lives. And while there, we should be decent, honest people who destroy bad ideas wherever we find them. Now, it just so happens that religion has more than its fair share of bad ideas. So I think, of necessity, we will continue to criticize religion. And religion, it must be recognized, is the only form of thinking in which bad ideas are held in perpetual immunity from criticism. And doing so is considered sacred. This is the act of faith. So I think of necessity we will be spending a lot of time talking about religion, but we should not name ourselves in opposition to religion. So what does all of this mean in practical terms, apart from Margaret having to change her letterhead? Well, rather than declare ourselves atheists, I think we should simply advocate intellectual honesty and reason. And where this advocacy brings us into collision with religion, as it inevitably will, we should notice that the points of collision are always with specific beliefs, and not with religion in general. There is no religion in general. And we should be quick, in fact, to point out the differences among religions. Because these differences make all religions, for 2 reasons, these differences make all religions look contingent and therefore silly. I would consider the unique features of Mormonism, which may play some role in the next presidential election. Mormonism, it seems to me, objectively, is just a little bit more idiotic than Christianity is. It has to be. It is Christianity plus some very stupid ideas. For instance, the Mormons think that Jesus is going to return to earth and administer his 1,000 years of peace, at least part of the time from the state of Missouri. Now, why does this make Mormonism objectively less likely to be true than Christianity? Because whatever probability you assign to Jesus' coming back, you have to assign a lesser probability to his coming back and keeping a summer home in Jackson County, Missouri. Mitt Romney, if he wants to be the next president of the United States, should be made to feel the burden of our incredulity. We can make common cause with our Christian brothers and sisters on this point. Just what does the man believe? The world should know about it, and it is almost guaranteed to be embarrassing even to most people who believe in a biblical God. The second reason to be attentive to the differences among religions is that these differences are actually a matter of life and death. There are very few of us who lie awake at night worrying about the Amish. This is not an accident. While I'm convinced that the Amish are mistreating their children by not educating them adequately, they are not likely to hijack aircraft and fly them into buildings. Consider how we as atheists are constrained to talk about Islam. And Christians often complain that atheists balance, and the secular media generally, balance every discussion of Islam with a discussion of extremist Christianity. The usual mode is to say, well, they have their jihadists, but we have people who kill abortion doctors. Okay, I think our Christian neighbors, even the craziest of them, are right to be outraged by this pretense of even-handedness. The truth is that Islam is quite a bit scarier and more culpable for needless human misery at this moment than Christianity has been for a very, very long time. And we have to point this out. Now, you might remember that Thomas Friedman recently wrote an op-ed from Iraq noticing that some Sunni militias were fighting alongside American troops against al-Qaeda, and he asked a Sunni militant why he was doing this. And the militant said that he had recently seen an al-Qaeda member decapitate an 8-year-old girl. And this convinced him that the American Crusader forces were the lesser of two evils. Now, okay, great. So even Muslims, even Sunni militants, can discern the line between ordinary crazy Islam and the utterly crazy, once it is drawn in the spilled blood of little girls. This is a basis for hope of sorts. I mean, we have to be clear, unremittingly clear about what is on the other side of that line. I mean, this is what we and the rest of the civilized world and the semi-civilized world are facing. Utter religious lunacy and barbarism in the name of Islam with, I'm unhappy to say, some mainstream theology to back it up. To be even-handed, as we are constrained to be as atheists, when discussing the problem of Islam, is to misconstrue the problem. The refrain that all religions have their extremists is bullshit. All religions don't have these extremists. Some religions have never had these extremists. A recent poll in the UK showed that a third of young British Muslims say they want to live under Sharia law and think that anyone who leaves the faith should be put to death for apostasy. This is a third of British Muslims. 68% of British Muslims think that their neighbors who insult Islam should be arrested and prosecuted. 78% think that the Danish cartoonist should be brought to justice. These people do not have a clue about what constitutes a civil society. It seems to me that reports like this coming out of Muslim communities living in the West should concern us before anything else about religion concerns us. Atheism is too blunt an instrument to use at moments like this. It's as though we have a landscape of human bewilderment and human stupidity, and atheism causes us to fixate on one part of this landscape. It's got peaks and valleys and local attractors, and we fixate on one part, that related to a belief in God, and then it just flattens it. Because to be consistent as atheists, we must oppose or seem to oppose all faith claims equally. But this is a waste of precious time and energy. And it seems to me it squanders the trust of good people who would otherwise agree with us on specific issues. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that we leave people's core religious beliefs unscathed, or faith itself unscathed. I'm still the person who writes articles with rather sweeping titles like "Science Must Destroy Religion." But what I am saying is we have to be attentive to necessary and useful differences among religions. Another problem with calling ourselves atheists is that every religious person thinks he has a knockdown argument against atheism. We've all heard these arguments, and we are going to keep hearing them as long as we call ourselves atheists. We've all heard the argument that the atheist can't prove there is no God. Or as Rick Warren put it when I debated him for Newsweek, a rational person like him doesn't have enough faith to be an atheist. Because the idea that the universe could be created without a creator is the most extravagant faith claim of all. Now, as Richard just pointed out, these arguments are travesties if they're used to defend any specific conception of God. And we all know what to do in this situation. We have Russell's teapot, we have the thousands of dead gods, and now we have a flying spaghetti monster, the non-existence of which can't be proven, and yet the existence of which is a belief in which is acknowledged to be ridiculous by anyone. The problem is we have to keep having the same argument over and over again. So too with the greatest crimes of the 20th century argument. How many times are we going to have to counter the charge that Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot represent the end game of atheism? I got news for you. This meme is not going away. I argued against it in The End of Faith, and it was immediately thrown up at me in reviews of the book as though I had never mentioned it. So I mentioned it again in the afterword to the paperback of The End of Faith, and this did no good whatsoever. So then I brought it up again. At the risk of boring all of you, I brought it up again in Letter to a Christian Nation. And Richard did the same in The God Delusion. And Christopher took a mighty whack at it in God is Not Great. I think this argument will be with us for as long as we call ourselves atheists. And it really convinces people. It really convinces liberals and moderates. It even convinces the occasional atheist. Why should we stand obediently in the space provided? Why should we stand in the space carved out by the conceptual scheme of theistic religion? I mean, it's as though our opponents, before any debate, have drawn the chalk outline of a dead man on the sidewalk, and we just walk up and lie down in it. Instead of doing this, think about what would happen if we simply use words like reason and evidence. Now, what is the argument against reason? It's true that certain people will bite the bullet here and say that reason is itself a problem and the Enlightenment is a failed project, but the truth is very few people are comfortable admitting to being enemies of reason. Even among fundamentalists, I would say especially among fundamentalists. They imagine themselves to be champions of reason. They think they have very good reasons for believing in God. Nobody wants to believe things on bad evidence. The desire to know what is actually going on in the world is very difficult to argue with. And insofar as we represent merely that desire, we become difficult to argue with. And this desire is not reducible to an interest group. It's not a club, and it's not an affiliation. And I think trying to make it one, or giving the appearance that it is one, necessarily diminishes its power. Now, the last problem with atheism I'd like to talk about relates to some of the experiences that lie at the core of our religious traditions, and perhaps not all religions, but most, I would think. This experience is often referred to under the banner of things like spirituality and mysticism, and is described in what has come to be known as spiritual or mystical literature. Now, those of you who have read The End of Faith know that I don't entirely line up with Dan and Christopher and Richard in my discussion of these topics, so I think I should talk about this for a moment. While I always use words like spiritual and mystical in scare quotes, and I try to denude them of metaphysics, my email suggests that many of my brothers and sisters in arms find my interest in these topics problematic. So I want to go into this in a little bit of detail. First, let me just describe the general phenomenon I'm talking about. A person, in whatever culture he finds himself, one day notices that life is difficult. He notices that in the best of times, even in the best of times, no one close to him has died. There are no hostile armies massing in the distance. The fridge is stocked with beer, and the weather is just so. Even when things are going as well as they can go, he notices that at the level of his attention, moment to moment, he is seeking happiness and only finding temporary relief from his search. And we've all noticed this, and we seek pleasant sights and sounds and tastes and sensations and attitudes. We become connoisseurs of art and music and literature. But our pleasures are, by their very nature, fleeting. I mean, the best we can do is merely reiterate them as often as we are able. If we enjoy some great professional success, this remains vivid and intoxicating to us for about an hour, maybe a day. But then people begin to ask you, well, what are you going to do next? You know, don't you have something in the pipeline? I mean, Steve Jobs releases the iPhone. I'm sure it wasn't 20 minutes before someone came up to him and said, when are you going to make this thing smaller? Now, notice at this juncture, very few people say, oh, I'm done. I've met all my goals, and now I'm just going to stay here and eat ice cream until I die in front of you. Even when things have gone as well as they can go, the search for happiness, the effort required to keep boredom and dissatisfaction and doubt at bay continues. At the very least, death and the loss of loved ones interrupts regularly even the most well-ordered and gratifying life. So in this context, many people have begun to wonder whether or not a different form of well-being, a deeper form of well-being exists, a form of well-being that is not contingent upon merely reiterating one's pleasures and avoiding one's pains. Is there a form of happiness that is not contingent upon always having one's favorite food available to be placed on one's tongue, or having one's friends and family within arm's reach, or having good books to read, or having something to look forward to on the weekend? Is it possible to be happy before anything happens, before one's desires get gratified, in the very midst of life's vicissitudes, in the very midst of old age, disease, and death? Now, I think this question lies at the periphery of everyone's consciousness. But we are all, in some sense, living our answer to this question. And many of us are living as though the answer is no. No, there is nothing more profound than seeking satisfaction, moment to moment. There's nothing more profound than reiterating your pleasures, sensory, emotional, intellectual. So many of us are living as though there's nothing to do but just keep our foot on the gas until we run out of road. But certain people, for whatever reason, wonder whether or not there's another strategy to be adopted than this. And many of them are led to wonder this by religion, by the example of people like the Buddha and Jesus and the literature that has grown up around these figures. And these people begin to practice various techniques of introspection, often called meditation or contemplation, as a means of training their attention on their moment-to-moment experience to see if there is a deeper basis of well-being to be discovered at all. They might even go into a cave for months or years at a time, or an ashram or some other secluded spot. Why would a person do this? Well, it's actually a very simple experiment. I mean, here's the logic of it. If there is a form of happiness to be found that is not contingent upon merely reiterating your pleasures, then it should be available in a circumstance where all obvious sources of pleasure have been removed. It should be available to someone who has gone to some secluded spot in the desert or in a cave, who has declined to marry her high school sweetheart, who has renounced all of her material possessions. It should be available in a context where that would on its face be deeply uncongenial to the satisfaction of ordinary desire and ordinary aspiration. Now, one clue as to how daunting most of us and most people would find such a project is that solitary confinement, which is essentially what we're talking about, is considered a punishment even inside a prison. I mean, even when confined with homicidal maniacs and rapists, most people still prefer the company of others to the prospects of being alone in a box for a significant stretch of time. And yet contemplatives for millennia claim to have found extraordinary depths of psychological well-being in circumstances very much like solitary confinement. Now, it seems to me, as rational people, whether we call ourselves atheists or not, we have a choice to make in how we view this whole enterprise. I mean, either the contemplative literature is a mere catalog of psychopathology and deliberate fraud and religious delusion, or people have been having interesting and sometimes normative experiences under the banner of mysticism and spirituality. Now, let me just assert, on the basis of my own study and experience, that I have no doubt that certain people have improved their self-understanding and their ethical intuitions, and even made genuine discoveries about the nature of subjectivity itself through traditional practices like meditation. I mean, leaving aside all the metaphysics and mythology and mumbo-jumbo, what contemplatives and mystics over the ages claim to have found is that there is an alternative to living at the mercy of the next neurotic thought that comes careening into consciousness. There's an alternative to being continuously spellbound by this conversation we are having with ourselves. And most of us think that if a person is walking down the street talking to himself, that is not able to censor himself in front of other people, he's probably mentally ill. But if we talk to ourselves all day long, silently, thinking, rehearsing prior conversations, thinking about what we should have said, we could have said, we might yet say, we just know enough to keep this silent, then this is perfectly normal. This is perfectly compatible with basic human sanity. Well, the experiences of contemplatives over the millennia suggest that this is not so, that there's another way of looking at this phenomenon. Now, of course, I'm by no means denying the importance of thought. I think thought is obviously indispensable for us. It's the basis of most culture. It's certainly the basis of all science. It's the basis of all of our social relationships. And linguistic thought is surely responsible for much rudimentary cognition. I mean, it's responsible for our ability to integrate planning and explicit learning and moral reasoning in many cases. I mean, even talking to oneself out loud might serve a function occasionally. But from the point of view of our contemplative traditions, and this is to reduce them all down to a cartoon version that ignores the rather esoteric disputes between them, our habitual failure to recognize thought as thought, our habitual identification with discursive thought, is a primary source of human suffering. And when a person breaks this spell, an extraordinary kind of relief is available. Now, the problem with a contemplative claim of this sort is that you can't borrow someone else's contemplative tools to test it. You have to develop your own tools. I mean, imagine if the science of astronomy, if you couldn't even observe whether there was a phenomenon worth looking at unless you built your own telescope. Okay, this would be an immense barrier to establishing astronomy as a science. It wouldn't make the sky any less worthy of our investigation, but it would be an immense impediment. To judge the claims of contemplatives, we have to build our own telescope. Judging their metaphysical claims and their philosophical claims, we can use thought itself. Many of these can be dismissed as bad science or bad philosophy on their merits. But to judge whether certain experiences are possible, and if possible, desirable, we have to be able to use our attention in the requisite ways, if only for a few moments. Now, one problem with atheism, it seems to me, as a category of thought, is that it is almost synonymous with not being interested in such phenomenon. It's almost synonymous with not being interested with what the Buddha or Jesus may have experienced in his life. And it seems to me that many atheists, though perhaps not all, reject such experiences out of hand as being either undesirable or impossible. Now, another common mistake is to imagine that whatever experiences these contemplatives have had, they're identical to experiences we're all familiar with. They're identical to scientific awe or aesthetic appreciation or artistic inspiration. Now, let me just say, as someone who has made his own modest efforts in this area, when someone goes into solitude for months or years at a time and trains himself in meditation for 15 to 18 hours a day, doing nothing but observe the contents of his own consciousness and try not to be lost in thought, not reading, not writing, not talking, just making a moment-to-moment effort to pay undivided attention to the arising of thought and to the arising of sensory experience. He experiences things that most scientists and artists are not familiar with unless they've made the identical introspective efforts. And these experiences have something to say about the plasticity of human experience itself and the possibilities of human happiness. So apart from just commending these phenomena to your attention, I want to say that our neglect of these phenomena as atheists puts us at a rhetorical disadvantage, because millions of people have had these experiences, and many millions more have had glimmers of them. And these experiences are often the most important and transformative moments in their lives. And if we, by definition, ignore them because of their entanglement with religion, we appear less wise than even our craziest religious opponents. Now, I don't know if the universe is, as J.B.S. Haldane said, not only stranger than we suppose, but stranger than we can suppose. But I'm pretty sure that it is stranger than we as atheists tend to represent while advocating atheism. I mean, as atheists, we tend to give people a sense, and even give ourselves a sense, that we are well on our way to purging the universe of mystery. As advocates of reason, we know that mystery is going to be with us for quite some time. In fact, there are good reasons to believe that mystery may be ineradicable from our circumstance. Because however much we understand the universe, it seems like there could well always be brute facts which we can't explain, but which we must use to explain everything else. Now, this is not a problem for human life. It is not a barrier to human happiness. But we are faced with the task of convincing a myth-infatuated world that love and curiosity are sufficient, and that you don't have to delude yourself and frighten yourself with Iron Age fairy tales. This is a monumental task. I don't think there's any intellectual struggle more worthy of our efforts. But it seems to me that we should not, in this effort, fight in well-ordered ranks like the redcoats of atheism. I think this may it's worth thinking about what victory will look like. And again, the example of racism seems instructive to me. What will it look like when we finally conquer the evil of racism? Should that happy day ever dawn? It's certainly not going to be a world in which a majority of people profess themselves to be non-racist. It will very likely be a world in which the very concept of separate races has lost its meaning. I think if we win this war of ideas with religion, we will find ourselves in a world in which the concept of atheism is scarcely intelligible. It will be a concept like non-astrology. Now, I think this is a future absolutely worth fighting for. I think it may, in fact, be the only future compatible with our survival as a species. I mean, this will be a world simply where people cease to praise one another for believing things or pretending to believe things for which they have no evidence. But the only path between now and then that I can see is for us to be unremittingly honest and to advocate intellectual honesty. And it seems to me that intellectual honesty will always be more durable and deeper and more easily spread than atheism. Thank you very much.
turn that light off behind his head. Sorry about that, but you were enlightening us, and the back of your head was all lit up.
Oh, okay.
We're going to have time for a few questions and answers, and so yes.
Hi. I just wanted to say that I agree with 99% of what you said on a conceptual level, but at the same time, you have to realize that throughout history, every instance of major social change has had to unite under some kind of banner. Like in slavery, there were abolitionists, or the civil rights movement, or anything like that. So how would you propose getting people who advocate rationality together to do that in order to make that kind of change possible, to get to the place that you want to go where atheism isn't even an issue?
Right, right. Well, I think it's, I'm somewhat agnostic about the best strategy for doing this, because I think that there may be, the distributed nature of it may in fact be a greater strength than having some kind of centralized, easily discerned movement. I just think it's, what we have to engineer somehow from 1,000 sides is a moment where it just becomes too embarrassing to advocate these ideas in the public space, or when people just can't keep a straight face when they say they believe in God or Jesus is coming back to say. And it's amazing. I mean, the people who do manage to keep a straight face at this moment are the editors of our major newspapers and magazines. I mean, I'm not talking about the Jerry Falwell types. We have to see the smile of irony and self-awareness emerge on their face first. And I think there's something about having a movement that, and this is just my suspicion, and I'll either be proven right or wrong, or we'll never know, but I notice the way the whole new atheist meme has spread, and I notice what people are doing with it. And it has been, I mean, there are people who are launching criticisms of Richard's work who clearly haven't read his work, but they feel that the concept of atheism is sufficient to inform them about the content of a God delusion. And likewise with all of our other books. And there's a shorthand which is circumventing thought, which doesn't occur when you point out just how crazy it is that these percentages of Muslims living in the West believe such and such, or that these percentages of Americans believe X, Y, and Z. When you get to specific beliefs, take something like stem cell research. We have to get to a world in which people recognize that it is intellectually untenable and now even immoral to believe that souls can live inside of petri dishes because of the promise of stem cell research. Something like 70% of Americans already agree with us. And when you get down to the brass tacks of whether they support the research and why. So it seems to me that we are at our strongest when we are hammering on specific issues and never naming ourselves, always throwing the burden of argument on our opponent, always using words like reason and evidence and talking about what we know about specific points, and showing the liabilities of certain beliefs being translated into specific behaviors in the world. And when you have neurosurgeons and engineers attempting suicide bombings on the streets of London and Glasgow, you have to talk about their specific set of ideas and their specific expectations. I mean, when a neurosurgeon leaps out of a flaming car yelling Allahu Akbar and tries to fight off the people trying to douse the flames, we know that is an existence proof of the fact that this is not merely a problem of education and economics. We have certain ideas being translated into very predictable behavior. So again, I think our movement is bigger than we realize, and we are circumventing that knowledge by our use of the label. Because again, I wrote The End of Faith, and I got there never being aware of atheist groups, atheist movements, and I was never tempted to call myself an atheist. Now, I could be a total anomaly, but I think there are many people who agree with us whenever we get down to brass tacks, who, for whatever reason, just because of how bad the PR is with this word, perhaps, would never come to a meeting like this.
As the only one from Utah here, probably. As the only one here from Utah, probably, I just want to say good job on your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And I just wanted to ask, me and a friend were having a discussion about you, and I was wondering what your position was on the idea of dualism, whether or not consciousness survives death, and if you're if you're for that, if you're going to publish any thoughts on that.
Right. Yeah, this is something that I've received a little heat for from my fellow atheists. Many people seem to think that I have published my beliefs about the survival of death and psychic phenomenon. I've never said I believe these things. I've just said that there apparently is data there worth talking about, and we should be open to talking about anything. I mean, we should all in this room be able to imagine a circumstance that would convince us of the truth of Mormonism. If someone presents that evidence, I'm all ears. Now, I'm not a dualist. I think dualism is a virtually, totally bankrupt idea at this point. But I don't know what I am in terms of the relationship between consciousness and the brain. If we lived in a universe where consciousness went all the way down somehow, if people like Roger Penrose are onto something and consciousness isn't merely a matter of computation, and there is some spookiness in our physics that we haven't accounted for and would provide the answer to consciousness. I'm not actually a fan of that particular theory, but let's say that were true. I would expect the universe to appear exactly the way it does now. I wouldn't expect this lectern to talk to me. I'm just, I just don't know. It's clear to me that we don't know the details about the emergence of consciousness. While we know enough to discredit the naive conception of a soul that floats off the brain at death and can still speak English and recognize grandma in a tunnel of light.
I wanted to ask, with regard to mystical or spiritual experiences, do you believe the people who claim to have those experiences are legitimately onto something not of this world? I know this is somewhat related to the past question. They're onto something not of this world, or are they just experiencing something, some kind of exotic cognitive or neuroscientific event that we just don't have the research on at present?
Well, there's nothing that I said that's incompatible with the truth of physicalism or materialism. I mean, I'm not making any metaphysical claims on the basis of meditational experience. And it's very clear to me that there are no experiences that people have while in meditation that justify most of the specific doctrines of our faith. There's no experience you can have while meditating that lends credence to the idea that Jesus was born of a virgin, for instance. I mean, that's just not the kind of thing that contemplative experience can do. And I don't know what consciousness is. And so I'm just agnostic about the implications. There's nothing that I've experienced that requires anything metaphysical. And it's the interest for me in meditation is in the difference between happiness and suffering. Why do we suffer? Is our suffering always necessary? These are the kinds of questions that I think are of interest to most people who spend any significant amount of time engaging practices like that.
I just want to say that I'm very disappointed by your speech.
Mm-hmm.
And
I imagine you're in good company, but
I don't believe at all that there is something supernatural, and I think you are going in that direction.
Okay, well, all I can do is reiterate that there's nothing that I've said, I mean, perhaps I misspoke or you misheard, but there's nothing that I am aware of believing that requires the supernatural. And I think as incredulous about what most people believe in under the guise of religion as anyone in this room. It's just there is a range of human experience that can take a tremendous amount of effort and inquiry to get a look at. And this has been historically the unique preoccupation of the mystical traditions within religion. It's very different within different religions. But the only people who have gotten it into their heads to go off into a cave for 10 years at a time have been, almost without exception, people in thrall to a belief system, a belief in the supernatural. And yet they've had experiences that are interesting and worth talking about, and don't lend credence to their supernatural doctrines, but which nevertheless have a lot to say about the plasticity of the human brain and the possibility of us transforming our moment-to-moment experience of the world. That's all I'm saying.
Sam,
Yeah.
I consider myself a disciple of yours. I've read your books. I've loved them. I've learned so much. But Sam, I need something to call myself. People talk about the fact that they're a Christian or a Catholic or a Muslim and they say, what are you? What are you? I need something to call myself. And I thought about this on a number of occasions. And one of the possibilities that occurred was that I might call myself a rationalist, because that's something that's very, very hard to object to. But I'm wondering what your answer to the question is, Sam. When people talk with you about your religious beliefs and ask you what you are, what you do, what is your answer to this?
Right. Well, this is a pragmatic question, because I started calling myself an atheist, or at least answering to the name, simply because it started to look a little shifty, dodging it in interviews. But because the truth is, I am an atheist by most people's standard of atheism, certainly. And so, just in the interest of being civil, I'm using that word. But I notice that we pay a price every time we do it, and I often, well, more often than not, point out that we're all atheists with respect to Zeus. A point that many of us have made, and again, the point about astrology. No, we're not naming ourselves in opposition to the 1,000 or million or billion bogus ideas that we could all entertain for a few moments. So I question whether we do need a name. I mean, I think just using words like reason and just asking people, just pointing out, for instance, as I did in Letter to a Christian Nation, that every Muslim is essentially an atheist with respect to Christianity, and every Christian returns the favor. I mean, everyone is in mutual criticism of everyone else's unfounded religious certainties, and when we notice those misalignments, I think we should exploit them. And answering to the name of atheist doesn't do it, because then the Muslims and Christians just say, oh, well, I understand what that guy thinks, he just hasn't found God. Yeah. I think Dan Dennett has a question here, and I'm reluctant to pass him up. I might as well take my licks publicly.
Run all the way up there, Dan, but I'll tell you what. Let Lori ask this question, then I'm going to run up to you.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you. If I understood you correctly when you answered the first question, I think you indicated that more important than having our names for a movement is getting the bills passed, like stem cell research. Mm-hmm. But you're a member of the advisory board of a group that would not exist if that were all that mattered, the Secular Coalition for America. And I thank you for that. But the only reason it exists, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Interfaith Alliance, these other groups deal with those issues.
Right.
It exists so that Brenda Fry's daughter doesn't get pushed in the schoolyard in second grade because she won't say under God in the pledge, because her family do identify as atheists. So, did I understand you correctly in the answer to the first question? Because I often make analogies to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender movement.
Right.
And I don't see how any movement can really progress if we don't identify ourselves.
Yeah, again, I'm open to argument on this subject, obviously, and maybe there's a word that is better than other words. I think secular is better, probably, than atheist. Humanist is better. I mean, if I had to pick one, I would pick something on that end of the spectrum. But again, I think it is, as a matter of just ideas, it seems unnecessary to me. And again, the example with racism seems most instructive to me because we haven't dubbed ourselves the antithesis of being racist. We've simply noticed all the mad work done in the name of ridiculous racial ideologies and fought those ideologies. And that's and obviously that fight continues. But it's at no point will I think it won't be a brilliant idea for anyone to say, aha, what we really need to do to just drive the nail in the coffin of racism is to name ourselves whatever it is, bright non-racists. And so maybe this is a transitional issue. Maybe it's true that it's necessary now and it's gotten us this far and it's sold books, or maybe not. But I just think I'm skeptical of. We didn't wake up one day feeling like we needed a label. I mean, people are telling us that we need a label. They're saying, what are you? You don't believe in God, so what are you? Are you a fill in the blank? And so we're playing a language game with people, and we, for the most part, because it's such a hassle to point out how ridiculous this is, we're saying, yeah, no, I'm an atheist. And pretty much that ends the conversation. It's not. Why not point out how ridiculous? I mean, there are many moves that we all make that I advocate and that are in the service of this. I mean, Richard's move of raising consciousness, point out the Christian child and the Buddhist child and the atheist child. I mean, that's ridiculous, and yet so few people realize that. I don't know. I mean, it's with some. You can imagine it's with some trepidation that I float this lead balloon for all of you to yeah.
Sam, I'd like to explore a little bit this interest of yours in mysticism and in contemplatives. You anticipate that I'm going to disagree with you violently. And I think from what you've said, maybe I don't disagree much at all. Or if I do, it's about whether you should do it for days or weeks, or whether maybe an hour is what's needed. I mean, I was courted by the TM people, the Transcendental Meditation people, to be their philosopher laureate for a while, and I looked at that and got into it a little bit and got interested. And still, when I need to calm down and sort of center myself again, I go into that routine. I always put a little timer on so I don't go to sleep every day. And so I guess I'm a novice. But it's useful, it's wonderful. And so I agree that there's, if you ignore the prospect that such solitude and deliberate emptying of your mind can stop the noise and give you some insights, I agree entirely with that. But what I haven't been persuaded of, and it seems maybe you have, I don't know why, is that if we look at the history of the more extreme contemplatives, the people who go off into a cave for years and years, or ascetics of one sort or another, what would lure me into their enterprise is if they came back with something that sounded really interesting. And for the life of me, it doesn't seem to me that their track record is very good.
Right.
I don't think you can list 3 interesting, really interesting, novel, original things that have come out of any of them. So that seems to me to be a sort of
Right.
waste of time and effort.
Okay, yeah, well, that's good. It's just, it's nowhere written that anything worth exploring or getting good at can be easily explored or easily acquired as a skill. And we know this from science, we know this from basically every human endeavor. I mean, how do you get good enough to be able to hit a golf ball like Tiger Woods? Well, unfortunately, you can't do it in an hour. And you can't do it just an hour a day. And most of us can't do it even if we purposed our entire existence toward that goal. You need the right genes, you need to start when you're 2 years old, whatever. So there is just this inconvenient fact that some of the more grandiose and interesting descriptions within the contemplative literature are somewhat difficult to cash out. And I mean, for one which I think is interesting, which actually converges with our area of interest in the philosophy of mind and neuroscience, is that really the central experience of many of these traditions, certainly the traditions within Buddhism, is to lose the sense of the subjective self. I mean, the sense of being a thinker of your thoughts, the experiencer apart from your experience. And most of us think that there's our experience, and then there's an I somewhere behind our eyes appropriating this experience moment to moment, thinking our thoughts. Now, as you know, at the level of the brain, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't, some significant meditation often reveals, doesn't make any sense at a level of our subjectivity. It's possible to lose the sense of being separate from one's experience and of riding around in one's head through meditation, and it can take some people years to do it, and there are some people who do it and they do it haphazardly. They don't know what they did with their attention to bring that on, and there's some people who actually master the skill of being at any moment able to actually just drop their sense of self, and this, it is reported, has many psychological benefits. I mean, it reduces anxiety, it reduces hatred, it reduces fear, and actually what you're left with when you do that more and more are rather good feelings. I mean, rather, compassion. And this is let's say this is true. It may not be true, but let's say it's true that there is a way of training attention so as to more and more encourage compassion toward the suffering of others and encourage sympathetic joy at other people's success rather than envy where you would otherwise feel it. And you actually can train positive emotions as a skill. This is certainly the testimony of any Buddhist worth his salt, and nobody says it's easy. And that's obviously, people like Richie Davidson are studying this in the lab at, with that functional MRI. I can just say, it's very common for people to go on a 3-month meditation retreat where literally this is all they're doing for 18 hours a day. And in the beginning, and the only thing they have to do is pay attention to their breathing in this practice, which is different from TM. And this sounds like the most boring thing in the world, and why would anyone do this? But you begin to notice some rather startling things when you try to do this. You first notice that it's almost impossible to do. I mean, your mind, you are just not built to. I mean, I can tell you, if I asked you all to just stop thinking and pay attention to your breath for the next 60 seconds and don't get lost in thought, there's not a person in this room very likely who could do it. I mean, if the fate of the earth depended on it, we couldn't do it. I mean, this is a remarkable fact about ourselves. And yet it is, when you look at it closely, this habitual entanglement with discursive thought, when you look at what we're thinking, all of the cranky, worthless thoughts we tend to think throughout the day, it is the tissue, it is the thread on which much of our suffering is strung. And I can just say that it is, it's not science. This is not, you certainly don't become aware of the neural underpinnings of all of this by doing it. But it opens you to a range of experience where the words of the mystics actually make sense and can reliably be divorced from their crazy metaphysics. So when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, who we are most of the time, that just seems like an impossible task, and maybe it's not even desirable. But there are experiences that people can have where they really do find they love a total stranger as themselves. And I think at some point we will understand just what love is at the level of the brain and how to encourage it and what blocks it and et cetera, and we'll know a lot more about the most positive end of human experience. But when we know that, I think we'll also recognize that certain people, by dint of their efforts in this area, have become a kind of moral athletes. I mean, there is a Tiger Woods of compassion out there. And he got there by some considerable effort. Now, maybe we'll have a pill to get us there in the future, but you have to acknowledge, I think we have to acknowledge there's a spectrum of positive mental attributes. I don't know if I answered your question, Dan, but thank you.